Well, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Pantir Sakri. I'm the museum's Chief Advancement Officer, and on behalf of our entire team, we are pleased that you're joining us for the first of our winter membership webinars. Today, of course, we're talking about the German-American artist Albert Bierstadt. In February, we'll be focusing on Bill Traylor, and in March, Anna Hyatt Huntington. A quick note that many of you know Eunice Nicholson, our membership manager and also oversees planned giving. She had to be suddenly away due to a family emergency, so she regrets not being with us today. She will be back in February, so we miss her, and she'll be sitting in this MC seat in just a few weeks. An update on the museum, because I know you're all interested, and some we're doing okay. We were open to visitors all summer and fall. Every single visitor expressed their gratitude for a space to contemplate, rest, and be inspired during these difficult days. The museum has been of great service to our visitors. And I thank you, members and donors who support us in making this possible so that we can remain accessible. Financially, we're in good health. We received a PPP loan and are now applying for a second round. And our donors have continued to be generous. So again, thank you. Our education and curatorial teams have offered a number of engaging webinars to ensure we can continue serving our audience, and they've been very popular and well attended. Unfortunately, last week we had to close again due to Teton County's purple/critical COVID status, which we consider the most prudent for our staff and visitors, but we hope to reopen our doors, fingers and toes crossed, on Tuesday, February 2nd. Now, on to today's webinar. We are all excited to learn more about Mr. Bierstedt, and our esteemed guests to lead this discussion are Jane Lavino, Sugden Chief Curator of Education, Tammi Hanawalt, Curator of Art, and Karen McWhorter, a Bierstadt Scholar, Scarlett, Curator of Western American Art for the Whitney Western Art Museum at the Buffalo Bill Center for the West in Cody. Last thing before we kick off with Jane, a few Zoom guidelines. First of all, we cannot hear or see you. So for any questions, just hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can pop a question in there at any time throughout the presentation. And Tammy's going to coordinate the Q&A. Hopefully we won't have any technical snafus, but it's all kind of in good fun today. So again, we're super glad that you're here. And without further ado, on to Jane.
Thanks, Pantir. Can you hear me okay? Great. So I am joining you from the National Museum of Wildlife Art classroom, as you can see from the mural behind me. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Albert Bierstadt, one piece in particular, but just to give you a little bit of background, here at our museum, we have 11 of his paintings in our collection and one print. The ones that may first come to mind for you are perhaps the moose, which is called In the Forest, that used to hang outside the Children's Gallery for a long time. Another one that may come to mind is Rocky Mountain Goat, which was in the JKM Gallery. I think it still is, actually. So those are some of the first ones that might come to mind, but we have some great pieces of his. But the one I'm going to focus on now is his painting of a butterfly. And it's one that we acquired via the Collector's Circle in 2014, and Allie's bringing it up. Some of you who are with us today may have voted for this piece. If so, thank you very much. It's a great piece. It's a small piece. It's only 4.5 inches by 7.5 inches. So it's quite small. The date, we're not quite sure if it was made sometime between 1873 and 1892. He was known to make these butterflies, and he made dozens of them during that time period. The material is oil on paper, and the paper I'll talk about in just a little bit. So the paint is oil on paper. The paper itself is a little bit unusual, but I'll get to that. We're going to stay right here on this slide while I read a fabulous quote for you. And it's one that Adam Harris found when he brought this painting to Collector's Circle. And it was from the journal of a Victorian woman who visited Albert Bierstadt in his studio. And he made these small butterfly paintings as souvenirs or sort of party favors to people who would visit his studio. So here's how she describes it. This woman was visiting his studio in 1892, and she says, he took out a palette, a knife, and some large slips of cartridge paper. Pay attention to the materials as I'm reading them off. 2 or 3 daubs of pigment on the paper, a quick fold, and holding it still folded against a pane of glass, he made 2 or 3 strokes on that wizard-like palette, using his knife on the outside, and hey, presto, a wonderful Brazilian butterfly or moth, even the veining on the wings, complete. A pencil touch added to the antennae, the artist's autograph added to the corner, and now each of us had our own painting by Bierstadt. So what I'm going to do for you now, look closely at that and notice the oil paint, notice the gestures, notice the antennae that were added later with the pencil. And right now I'm going to switch to a demonstration, and I'm going to let you know that I'm not as good as he was at creating these, but I can show you the method. Okay, we're going to switch. And can you see that, Puntier?
Not yet, Jane.
Not yet. Okay. It worked on the trial run.
Every time, right?
Right. I'm going to try again. Okay, we're going to try again. Here we go. Now, can you see it?
Sugar, Jane, I'm not sure what happened
Okay, let me
here.
try. I'm going to try one more time. Hang on. Share screen. Now, can you see it?
There you go. Beautiful.
Okay, okay. So if you're listening carefully, you heard that he was using oil paints. I have some oil paints here. I tried to be as faithful as possible to his methods. There was a mention of cartridge paper, so I was not familiar with that, and I looked it up. It was a common drawing and painting paper, but it got its name because this paper was used as a cartridge for ammunition in a certain type of firearm. It was a thick, heavy paper, and it was the casing for the ammunition. But I could not find cartridge paper, so I tested a bunch of different papers, and I settled on vellum, which is an artist paper commonly used for ink and pencil. So vellum works pretty well. I also have a palette knife, which he mentioned, and a piece of glass, which was also mentioned. So I'm going to start by folding the paper like that. I'm going to open it back up. I'm going to take some of my yellow oil paint here, and I'm going to start adding it. I can see I thought oil paint never dried up, but it appears to have dried up just a little bit. I'm going to put a little bit more on here due to that drying factor while I was talking. Here we go. So keep in mind, he was probably much, much, much quicker than I am at applying the paint. So perhaps it really did look like a magic trick to those ladies. A little bit more. Notice I'm only putting the paint on the one side of this folded paper. There's a reason for that. Okay, I'm going to give a little bit extra. You noticed on his, you may remember having seen a variety of colors. So I'm going to add some other colors here, maybe a little bit of red. And I'm going to add a touch of blue, just because I keep looking at his and seeing all these beautiful colors. And I'm going to add some black in the center where the body is. And I'm going to add what might be a head up here. I'm going to use the edge of my palette knife to drag some of that paint down that way. Okay, now for the presto part. I'm going to fold it. And I'm going to use the end of my palette knife to do some of the veining or the markings that he talked about. There was a marking coming down along the chest. There was a marking coming down, sticking out as if it were perhaps a leg. There were some markings coming across this way. A few marks. Does it look like a magic trick yet? Okay, ready? Just for good measure, I'm gonna press it a little bit with my fingers. Ready? Presto. And then they described a pencil used to draw the antennae, and then he signed it. And then this was given as a souvenir to these Victorian ladies who came into the studio. Hopefully that, again, I apologize, not nearly as good as his. He did, like I said, dozens and dozens of these. These are just a few I pulled from the internet. But before I botch this anymore, I'm gonna stop my screen sharing and go back to the program.
That was beautiful, Jane. That is such a cool butterfly. I think Tammi is unmuting now because she will be up next.
Okay. And there I am. Thank you, Jane. That was great. I think you did a fabulous butterfly. Don't let anybody tell you different. Pass it off as a Bierstadt. Sign the name. Welcome, everyone. I am here to introduce our guest speaker today. Karen McWhorter is the Scarlett Curator of Western American Art at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. She oversees the Whitney Museum, and if you haven't had a chance to get to that museum lately, I think you will find that there have been some changes and it looks really wonderful. Karen's area of expertise include 19th century artist explorers, American landscape painters, the Taos Society of Artists, and contemporary Western American artists. She holds an MA in art history from the University of Colorado, Boulder. And since 2015, Karen has overseen the development of 7 traveling exhibits, which is really incredible. And one includes the Albert Bierstadt Witness to a Changing West that took place in 2018, and which the National Museum of Wildlife Art loans some of our Bierstadt works, 3 to be exact. And I was fortunate to see that show. And this is why we have asked Karen here to speak to us about Bierstadt today. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you, Tammi, for that kind introduction and for the invitation today. I'm going to take a second and share my screen. All right, team, can you see my PowerPoint?
Looks great, Karen.
All right, wonderful. Well, again, Tammi, thank you. And thank you to the rest of the gals for allowing me the opportunity to be here today. And thanks to all of you society members who are joining us remotely. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I do want to extend an invitation to you all to come visit Cody when time and safety permit. I can say with some objectivity, but mostly with a lot of subjectivity, that the Center of the West houses a treasure trove, veritably, of Western American art. And pertinent to our topic today is the fact that we have 35 Bierstadt paintings. So there's a lot we could talk about when it comes to Albert Bierstadt. We could really spend the entirety of our time together today discussing just one of his major works, but acknowledging that we've all come today with different levels of familiarity with the artist, I thought that I would provide a broad brush overview of his life and career with a special focus on his time spent in the West, because that's, of course, where we all find ourselves in a region in which we live and love, and offer a little insight into that special exhibition that Tammi mentioned, which we here at the Center of the West produced back in 2018. And along the way, kind of as a break of sorts, we'll pause and look carefully, look closely at a few special paintings slowing things down really to soak up the incredible depth and detail. So Albert Bierstadt, what comes to mind when you hear his name? I think for most, sweeping landscapes painted at epic scale, like the painting on your screen and also my fabulous background here. This is a personal favorite. It's called Sierra Nevada Morning, and it's from the collection of Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Bierstadt certainly should be remembered for his landscape paintings of the American West. His paintings of the Rockies and the Sierras were groundbreaking and influential at their time. And still today, they're some of the most iconic and recognizable depictions of our region. The artist's best known canvases feature, like Sierra Nevada Morning does, expansive valleys that dissolve into glowing brilliance at their far reaches, precipitous peaks that are shrouded in clouds, almost married with the sky, glassy mountain lakes that reflect their breathtaking surroundings, doubling their splendor. This is really a classic Bierstadt painting, but in fact, Bierstadt depicted European scenes and also American landscapes ranging from Alaska to the Caribbean, but also other subjects too, including the American Western people and wildlife, so indigenous peoples and endemic wildlife. These three images that you see are some among innumerable examples in Bierstadt's oeuvre, in his body of work, where the artist gave prominence to people and to animals. Here, of course, he's drawing inspiration from the American West. So Bierstadt rose to prominence in the late 1850s. He was at the time in his early 30s. He worked hard to become a leading American painter. And I say worked hard because he absolutely did. He was known as a tireless entrepreneur and self-promoter. He enjoyed fame and fortune during his lifetime. That was pretty unique. But he also became the target of increasingly negative criticism in his later years. And he watched as his patronage and his wealth dwindled, primarily because he held fast to a particular style of art, a brand, if you will, that fell out of favor. It became passé in his later years. Ultimately, Bierstadt's legacy today encompasses dramatically mixed reviews from critics and audiences, both about his persona, that tendency toward self-promotion, and about his art, particularly that style to which he was so committed. So as his name might imply, and as the daughter of a German teacher, I want to pronounce it in the German way, Bierstadt, as his name might imply, Albert Bierstadt was German born. He was born in 1830. He immigrated with his family to Massachusetts when he was just 2 years old. In 1853, he returned to Germany to study in Dusseldorf, very near where he had grown up those first 2 years. This decision would indelibly affect his artistic style and his choice of subjects throughout his life. While studying in Germany, he met and befriended artists like Emanuel Leutze, who would become titans of their genre. He studied the work of the old masters, traveled the continent, and he returned to America in 1857. So in the West, in 1859, just 2 years after he returned from Europe, he took his first trip west. He joined a government survey expedition led by Colonel Frederick West Lander. The expedition's goal was to chart an overland trail to Oregon. Bierstadt's goals were slightly different. He was seeking adventure, for sure. He also wanted to study the scenery, he said. And like artists Carl Weimar and Alfred Jacob Miller before him, he wanted to study Indian life. He reported this to a local New Bedford, Massachusetts newspaper. He actively wanted to participate as well in defining American art by applying his studies, what he'd learned in Europe and in the States, to the depiction of distinctly American subjects. He really saw an opportunity to kind of get in on the ground floor in the West, to be among the earliest artists to celebrate and scrutinize the region through art. So this first trip, he traveled with 2 other artists whose names are not well known to us today, Hitchings and Frost. We know them, we are historians, but they aren't as well regarded as Bierstadt's work. This group left in mid-April from St. Louis. They were headed west on the Oregon Trail, and by summer they had reached our Wind River Range. Out at South Pass, almost between you and I, you all in Jackson and me and Cody, Bierstedt separated from the Lander party to explore. I wanted to show you just a few of Bierstedt's earliest Western paintings. On the left, we see Lander, the leader of the expedition, on horseback, looking every inch the mountain man. We also see at top the means by which immigrants were transporting goods at this time by covered wagon. And then one of the most famous landmarks along the Oregon Trail, Chimney Rock. He would repeat this and other well-known geological formations in his paintings to place them along the trail in the west. Bierstedt made sketches like these three on the way, and he often quickly composed these sketches, interestingly, in oil on small panels. That's very different than, say, Alfred Jacob Miller before him or Thomas Moran after him. Most artist explorers actually would work in watercolor on the trail. Watercolor was far quicker to dry, materials were more easily prepared, and also all of the supplies were easier to tote. But Bierstedt found that he worked best beginning in oil on panel. He also, most people don't know this, but he also took photographs. His brother was actually a renowned photographer in New York. Many of Albert Bierstedt's early photographs feature Native people. This proves to us an early interest in indigenous cultures in the West. He really wasn't myopically focused on the landscape. Others of Bierstedt's 1859 sketches further evidence this early interest in Native peoples and in wildlife. I love these two that I'll share next. This is Studies of Bison, an incredible collection of sketches. It pairs a portrait of a Native American figure in profile with anatomical studies of bison from varied angles and at differing levels of maturity. This is from our friends at the Gilcrease Museum. The second is this wonderful pencil sketch entitled Buffalo Head. He's really working to get the anatomy just right. So when Bierstedt returned east back to his New Bedford studio, this was in the fall in about September, he combined all of these sources, so oil sketches, drawings, and photographs, combined those with his recollections and a healthy dash of artistic license to create his first polished paintings of the West, like this painting on the right, which he quickly completed after his return. This is Sioux Village near Fort Laramie from the Blanton Museum of Art's collection in Texas. Many of these early Western paintings featured Native peoples or villages. Some were pure landscapes though, and this is again kind of what we think of when we think of Bierstadt. This incredible painting is Island Lake. Let me see. Oh, I don't think I can get rid of that top line, but I'm not sure that it's impeding too much in the image. But this fabulous painting is Island Lake, and this is one of my personal favorites in the Whitney's collection. I'd like to look closely at this beauty, which is truly an archetypal example of Bierstedt at his best when he's depicting the Western landscape. It's dramatic, it's theatrical. And by the way, you cannot stand in this particular spot in the Wind Rivers. Many have tried. I've chatted with many a hiker and modern day explorer trying to find this spot and others. But Bierstedt really does make it feel like we can stand here. He accomplishes this, a sense that you, the viewer, me, that we can stand at this incredible precipice atop a rumbling waterfall which empties out of sight and far below us into a light-struck glassy lake beyond which stretches endless plain interrupted only by craggy ridgelines until both merge with a glowing horizon. Bierstedt accomplishes this through technical virtuosity. There's no doubt about it. He was an incredible technician, an incredible painter, skilled. He invokes atmospheric perspective, wherein the foreground is meticulously detailed and the background, as it recedes, landscape features become less specific. They literally dissolve into the haze. He also positions us, the viewers, in a privileged position. We're invited to take it all in. And some historians would say he invites us to own the view with our gaze. Perhaps Bierstadt was catering to a growing population of European descended Americans who saw the West as a place of freedom, of opportunity, of the fulfillment of manifest destiny. As is the case with this painting, Bierstadt surely imbued his work with messages and meanings that conveyed his own beliefs and attitudes of the time. They're surely, his paintings, more thoughtful, more calculated, more meaningful than they first might appear. And this harkens back to his training, his academic training in Germany. Now, the most significant work that Bierstadt created following that first trip west was this painting, the Rocky Mountain Lander's Peak. I wanted to give you a sense of scale of this work because you can't really get that sense just by looking at a PowerPoint slide. But here you see that this painting is a behemoth. It's 10 feet wide. It's on view at the Met, which is the institution who owns this work now. And it's really an incredible experience to stand in front of it. Unlike Island Lake, this painting was not a pure landscape. There is, as I show in detail here, a Shoshone village prominently depicted in the foreground. This painting combines an awe-inspiring landscape in the background with a quiet genre scene featuring activities of everyday life in the foreground. You can see harvested animals of all varieties. There's a bear, bighorn sheep, pronghorn, geese, fox, elk. There are very specifically rendered objects of native manufacture, parfleche, saddles, tapestries, and clothing. Some of these may have been drawn from life after his trip west based on items that he collected there. You can also see a range of figures and goings-on. A child rests in a cradle board leaned against the teepee entrance. Dogs wander the campsite. Horses graze from foreground to back. And conversations transpire among individuals and groups. Now, this painting was met with some glowing reviews, but also some more negative feedback. From a financial standpoint, its sale was a major coup for Bierstadt. It brought $25,000, which was among the highest prices ever paid to date for an American artwork. Regarding critical reviews, some claimed that Bierstadt was falsifying and over-dramatizing. But we, present-day historians, don't believe that Bierstadt was aiming for veracity, for truthfulness. And when you compare field sketches with finished paintings, you can see that he was skilled in accurately describing geology and geography in paint. We know also, as I showed earlier, that he took photos to capture specificity for reference. So he chose actively to compose, to select, to exaggerate. He created polished studio paintings that convincingly blended details of the Western landscape with a sense of heightened drama, on purpose, for sure. With major canvases, he sought to convey something grander than just a translation of visual fact. He could do that. As we established, Bierstadt infused his paintings with messages and meaning, and thus they shouldn't be taken at face value. A painting like this one, especially at this scale, was intended to envelop those who viewed it, to allow us today to imagine being there, to vicariously experience America's far reaches. This resonated with a public eager to learn more of the West and who sought visual confirmation that their own nation held natural wonders as magnificent, or maybe more so than those in Europe. Our Rockies are grander than the Alps, these artists were contending. And even today, you do feel quite literally enveloped standing in front of a painting like Lander's Peak. You're dwarfed by these soaring peaks that tower above you. It was a thoughtful set of decisions made by the artist to work at such a large size. This monumental canvas attempts to suggest the West's epic scale. Bierstadt was making a statement about the majesty and awesomeness of the West. He was bolstering claims of opportunity, of promise in the West for its European American inhabitants. It's also suggesting that the West might hold hope yet for a reconciled America, which was at the time of this painting's creation embroiled in civil war. So when we're looking at Bierstadt's work, remember that his studio paintings are most often composites. They're mixtures of reality and fancy, and they sought to idealize, not translate factually. They're infused with symbolism. So in 1863, Bierstedt heads west again to California this time through the central Rocky Mountains of Colorado. He spent time in Oregon and the Columbia River Valley, but very importantly, he was introduced to Yosemite. He spent 7 weeks there. He loved it. He was inspired to create paintings like this one called Valley of the Yosemite. And again, he was working from photographs and on-site sketches. And here's a painting inspired by the Estes Park area in the Colorado Rockies. These two beautiful places, Yosemite and the area that would become Rocky Mountain National Park, are the western locales for which Bierstadt would become most closely associated. I just wanted to illustrate quickly as well the degree to which Bierstadt drew on established frameworks that he made, and to acknowledge the artifice of his art. Art is artifice, in fact. I wanted to share this kind of superimposition of Valley of the Yosemite laid over that Estes Park scene. You'll see that they share many common tropes, including a low horizon line, soaring peaks, including animals in the foreground. The painting behind me does as well. This is both for scale, so the mountains look even grander in comparison to these miniature animals, and also to suggest the wildness of the place. In 1880, Bierstadt went west again to California, Washington, and British Columbia. And I want to talk a little bit about one trip, 1881, to Yellowstone. Many people might not know that Bierstadt actually was invited to go along with Ferdinand van de Veer Hayden in 1871 to accompany that first government expedition, which would result in Yellowstone becoming the world's first national park. Yosemite was established before, but it was actually administered by the state, not the federal government. So Yellowstone is the world's first national park. But 1871 rolls around and Bierstadt's busy. He's working on a commission in California and feels like he's busy enough. It was, of course, Thomas Moran, a favorite artist of mine, who would stake his claim in Yellowstone. He'd help provide visual evidence for its uniqueness and thus the urgent need for its preservation. Moran's major paintings depicting the national park would don the halls of Congress, and he would even take on the moniker Thomas Yellowstone Moran, signing his paintings TYM. So Bierstadt missed a bit of an opportunity there. But again, he would become known as kind of the patron artist of Yosemite and Rocky Mountain National Parks. But he gave a bit of time until he went to the park. He headed to Yellowstone himself a decade after Moran's trip. And he found there new inspiration in the park's geological and geothermal features. I wanted to look quickly at two of our masterworks from this trip. Both of these you can see on view at the Whitney presently. These are favorites of mine. On the left, we have Yellowstone Falls, and on the right, Geysers in Yellowstone. You'll notice by the dates that he completed these very shortly after he returned, which he was there in the summertime. And just to note quickly in terms of visual analysis, look at the light in these images. It's really divine. I miss dearly my colleague Peter Hasrick, who in discussing Yellowstone Falls talked about the diaphanous clouds separating to reveal the falls. There is so much a sense of the divine here. And we are privileged again with the perfect moment. The geyser erupts, the clouds reveal the falls. It's only us. We have the lay of the land all to ourselves. It's pretty spectacular. And I wanted again to give you a sense of scale of these two paintings. Here they are installed in a gallery setting at the center. So they're quite large. These were finished studio paintings. But on the left, you'll see next to these two are two really wonderful sketches, studies from the field. And when I hang these in the Whitney, I at first labeled them as sketches because that's what they are. But our visitors were very confused. They were wondering where these sketches I was referencing were, because the sketches look so finished, so polished, that they do look like completed paintings. So as I mentioned earlier, Bierstadt, apart from his Western adventures, traveled extensively elsewhere. He was in the Caribbean, where his wife found respite from a long-term illness. He went to Europe over and over again. But amid these travels, and despite great successes in the 1870s and into the 1880s, things did take a turn for the worse. Increasing were the number of critical reviews. He continued to paint in this traditional academic style, and it was becoming outmoded among buyers and critics. Paintings that would have sold years before for $25,000 or maybe even $35,000 were only commanding about $5,000 now. His entries into important exhibitions were declined. In 1882, this is tragic, the artist's Hudson River mansion, which he had built to spec, it burned to the ground. He lost most of his own paintings that were housed in his studio there, and his collection of fine art and artifacts also went up in the blaze. Many of those artifacts were of Native American manufacture, which he collected in the West. We can only speculate as to the extent of these collections. And then his wife, Rosalie, she is struggling with a long-term illness. She eventually passes away in 1893, and Bierstadt files for bankruptcy. Not a great couple of decades. But with all this going on, Bierstadt's faith in himself and in his skill and in his vision never seems to have wavered. And so, ever sure of himself, in 1888, he created what became known as his last great picture, The Last of the Buffalo. Really, I should say last great pictures, plural, because there were two versions of this painting, one of which we at the Whitney Western Art Museum are lucky enough to own, and that's the one that's pictured here. Again, this is a biggie. It's 8 feet wide. You can see it at left here. It was rejected from the 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle. So Bierstadt decided, fine then, I'm going to show it alongside the exposition at the Paris Salon, which happened concurrently with the Universal Exposition. So that rejection was tough, but especially because it came from many of his peers, friends. But redemption came in the form of a second version of this painting. This is the Whitney's again, which was purchased for $50,000. Again, huge, huge sum. With the last of the buffalo, rather, Bierstadt gave prominence not to the West's landscape, but to those emblems of the Western frontier, American Indians and bison. Last of the Buffalo was the inspiration for and the centerpiece of the exhibition I mentioned earlier, Albert Bierstadt, Witness to a Changing West, which we produced in 2018. Now, why produce another exhibition on Albert Bierstadt? This has been done before. Yes, we recognize that. But we also recognize that Bierstadt's landscape paintings of the American West, they had been critically assessed, more so than any other part of his opus. And we, the curators, wanted to acknowledge the skill and spirit that went into Bierstadt's figural compositions, those featuring humans and animals, those narrative works. So regarding the latter, animal paintings, we were really thrilled, as Tammi mentioned, to include 3 of the National Museum of Wildlife Art's wildlife paintings in our checklist. These are those 3, and they're really very spectacular. We were so happy to have them. So our exhibition focused especially on Bierstadt's paintings featuring Plains Indian peoples and American bison, which we contend Bierstadt saw as prime subjects for his art, and which he continued to incorporate in landscape paintings throughout his career. We also studied the artist's engagement with contemporary political and social debates around wildlife conservation and management in America, our national parks, and the indigenous peoples of the American West. My colleague, who I mentioned earlier, the late great Peter Hastrick, argued that Bierstadt's Last of the Buffalo gave voice to contemporary concerns about the fates of Native peoples and wildlife in the West. We know that Bierstadt was witness to repercussions of westward expansion by Euro-Americans. Native peoples had been pushed onto reservations, their lives and cultures ever forever altered. Disease and disturbance brought death and destruction, and the American bison as a species faced near extermination. The only dwindling population left at this point was conscribed to the newly established Yellowstone National Park. Our exhibition suggested that through his art and through his involvement in contemporary debates, Bierstedt witnessed and testified to the changes that he saw. So while some of his earlier paintings might have promoted the idea of manifest destiny by excluding or idealizing the presence of Native peoples, our exhibition argued that this late painting, created just a decade before the artist passed, had a different goal. We suggested that this painting was intended to make the public more aware of the fates of Native peoples and wildlife in the West, that they were both under threat. It did glorify historical subjects, in that way it's backward looking, but we're really speaking metaphorically to modern issues, especially the decimation of the bison. It depicted an earlier chapter of the American West when bison ranged in vast herds and the region's indigenous peoples were still living freely. If we look closely at the painting, we can begin to decode its rich symbolism. So I show here a close-up, excluding a bit of the sky, but focusing on the main figures. So we have at center the interlocking figures of a buffalo bull and a mounted Indian. Some more contemporary critics have suggested that here's Bierstadt implicating Native peoples in the decimation of the bison again. But Peter Hasrick actually didn't believe this to be the case. Rather, that the interlocked combatants show that their fates are actually linked, that they're both in grave trouble in the wake of Western settlement by European descended Americans. In the foreground, we see dead and dying bison. And less visible, maybe I can show you with my mouse here, is a horse and rider, also fallen. At left, this trail bifurcates. It splits into two. What starts, some suggest, as a game trail, a trail tracked by animals, splits into wagon ruts. So this kind of signifies symbolically the turning of a page, the new chapter, which would negatively affect aspects of the American West and its history. That trail leads us to a single bison right here. He's at left. He's watching this dramatic scene unfold. And interestingly, look at this light. So this really theatrical, almost stage lighting carries our gaze. If we follow the trail to the bison, our gaze is then carried back to the central elements. This same lighting here, this flax and gold, is linking the foreground and the background. Same tones are used here. And the background really evidences what's at stake in all this. If you look carefully, what look almost like ants at a picnic site, this is almost innumerable bison and other diverse wildlife running across the plain in numbers that are impossible to count in number. So we see skulls, bones scattered across the foreground. These evidence the destruction past, present, and unfortunately future, Bierstadt suggests. And interestingly, this single sun-bleached skull in the foreground stares directly at us the viewer, and it implicates us in the destruction of bison on the plains. Now this work is really amazing, and I do hope that you come stand in front of it at the Whitney Western Art Museum. I'll show you the other version. This is a slightly larger painting. It was painted first. This is the version that was shown in Paris, and this is owned by the Corcoran collection within the National Gallery. So you'll need to travel to DC when it is safe to do so. The palette is slightly different, but in some, the parts are the same. And you might ask why he painted two versions. I mentioned that he was quite the entrepreneur, the businessman. He had a buyer for a second version. So in many cases, artists created nearly duplicative compositions to satisfy the needs of buyers. And in this day and age, with images not as easily accessible, these paintings would have lived very separate lives. So I'll wrap up there, not to take any more time, and hopefully answer a couple questions, but I leave at the top of the screen my email address and my desk line. I'd love to show you around the Whitney. My favorite thing, as I've told Tammi, is to be your own personal Vanna White in this treasure trove of Western American art. So let's turn to some questions perhaps. And if we need to go back and look at any slides, I'd be happy to do so. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. That was magnificent. The images are just, I forget how incredible those Bierstadt images are. We do have the moose exhibited here. His East Coast moose that you had in the show is exhibited in our JKM gallery right now. But we have some questions for you.
Great.
One of the first ones of the questions was, what kind of camera did he use?
Great question. So he was creating stereoscopic images. And for those of you familiar with the history of photography, stereoscopic images paired two photographs taken from nearly the same vantage point that when looked at through a specific device, a stereoscope, it would almost give you the effect of being there, of 3 dimensions. So to your question though, he was working with glass plates in the field. So this was an incredibly cumbersome process. Same as was William Henry Jackson slightly later with Moran in Yellowstone. But as I mentioned, Bierstadt's brother, Edward, was a highly regarded and well-known photographer. So Bierstadt was skilled in the trade as well, but surely he had his brother help develop and produce the prints when he was back on the East Coast. Thank you.
Well, then we'll just jump right into the whole thing about Native Americans.
Yeah. So the question,
you mentioned that, but do you think he had concerns?
So the question is, do we think that Bierstedt had concerns about Native people's loss of land, lifestyle, and I would add, the well-being of bison as well. And we, the team who created this exhibition about which I spoke, surely believe this is the case. And we looked at several different forms of evidence to make that claim. Firstly, we did look at his art. There's a lot to be gleaned in terms of messages and meanings from his art, but that can be quite subjective. And here we are from the present day looking backwards. So we also looked at his involvement with debates at the time. Regarding wildlife conservation, he was one of the founding members of the Boone and Crockett Club, which was the first wildlife conservation organization in North America. So that's interesting. He was very aware then of issues around species, longevity, and extinction. But regarding Native peoples, we do have, written record of him, speaking to this idea that Native Americans' fate was sealed essentially with westward migration. But we also have him showing such respect for Native peoples and their cultures through his art, through his collection of their artifacts, and also by his commitment to visiting them on his trips in the West. So yes, we do believe that he had concerns. Now, of course, he was a man of his time. So these ideas of manifest destiny, though they weren't talked about as such, and vanishing race were certainly kind of, around, and he was very much a part of forwarding some of those conversations. But yes, we do think he was concerned, and that the last of the buffalo is really his final grand statement about this concern.
Great, yeah, and George Catlin working at the same time, trying to record all the Native people. So that got to be in a lot of artworks. And you answered one question about manifest destiny, how Bierstadt looked at that idea that a settlement was imbued by God at the time that was so interesting. who were the paint? I thought that it was interesting too, that a lot of those paintings you showed us, or some of the paintings you showed us, especially those very grand ones, were on the East Coast.
Mhm.
So did Bierstadt have important or primary patrons?
He did. You know, he was interested in selling to anyone who had the funds. His main goal was to sell to Congress, like Thomas Moran had, and he did succeed in that with some Yosemite paintings. But he had patrons East Coast and in Europe. For instance, our painting Last of the Buffalo was purchased by this gentleman, Sir Thomas North, who was the nitrate king. So he was selling to titans of industry, many people who had investments in the West, those associated with railways and other facets of bringing technology to the West. And yes, I think many historians can very convincingly argue that his paintings did promote ideas of manifest destiny, specifically because in some cases their exclusion of Native peoples. And again, I was talking about that, giving us the viewer that privileged position, and the viewer that he's talking to is a specific type, an affluent, you know, European or American of European descent. So there's a lot of rich message and meaning there. You'll see similar tropes used by others among the Hudson River School and then those first early artists in the West. But it's interesting to see how artists were participating in these conversations that play out, you know, in the newspaper and in public speeches. Otherwise, that their messages are more implicit rather than explicit, but we can decode them to some degree. And again, look to their relationships with others at the time and with current contemporary debate.
Great. I want to remind everybody that this is going to be taped. So if you unfortunately have to leave us, we will make sure you get a link to come back to the video if you want to take a look at the question and answer part. But there's a really interesting question here that I don't know if anyone has ever addressed it. If he was working during the Civil War years, what were his positions on those issues?
It's a good question. And he actually does have very few, but a couple Civil War paintings. I imagine and I actually can't speak with much fluency about this, but I imagine as a man of Massachusetts that he supported the Union cause. But I would like to look further into that for some follow-up. And I imagine our colleague Peter Hesrick, who is no longer with us, could speak eloquently to that. But I imagine his alignment was with the North.
Great.
But again, he was working, as you say, right during the throes of all this.
Yeah.
So his participation was really truly as an artist, not in the field, on the battlefield, but looking west as, you know, as a place of possible reconciliation and hope and promise.
Yeah, it is really interesting that the Civil War did actually, you know, there were people on either side going west too. So that was really, really interesting to understand that too. This is an interesting question. What was the status of the bison when Bierstadt was painting them? Were they fantasy or real? I guess that's meaning in numbers.
That's a great question. It actually changed quite a bit from when he first went west in 1859 to his later trips in the 1880s. Those 3 decades saw the near decimation of bison in the West. Truly, we almost lost the species, our most iconic land mammal. There was only a small herd, you know, kind of set aside in Yellowstone. So what we know of bison today are really descendant, for the most part, from that herd. Now, Canada and Texas had a couple other herds that were privately owned, interestingly. So we almost lost them, and now their wildness today actually comes from a pinch point of management. And you know, when Bierstedt first went west, he participated in a bison hunt on his 63 trip. and then became more and more a conservationist as many sportsmen are. So we almost lost him. And
Yeah.
Bierstedt, we contend, was bearing witness to that.
Right, right. Did he have any children?
He didn't, to my knowledge. And interestingly, I should mention his wife, Rosalie, was actually the ex-wife of his traveling partner, Fitzhugh Ludlow, with whom he traveled west. So he became acquainted with his would-be wife through his traveling partner, this author, and then married her later after they divorced.
Oh, wow. I thought it was interesting to hear about the spouses of painters during this time period and them going out west, and even Bill Cody and his wife and their relationship was super interesting. Let's see. Did he have a particular teacher or tutor? I know he went to Europe and as was the Grand Tour, part of his probably education, like it was a lot of people who painted. Maybe you can speak to that, Karen?
Absolutely. His training was thoroughly academic. So this would have been based in life drawing, in plein air studies of the landscape. He's truly a technician, and by that I mean he knows how to handle materials, and he knows how to depict the human form, wildlife, landscape accurately. He chose to exaggerate when he wanted to. And I mentioned Leutze specifically because he was an artist that had a really big impact on Bierstadt, and that kind of art impacted his style of choice. So Leutze is known, of course, for Washington Crossing the Delaware, which is a richly symbolic painting. And Bierstadt's art too was richly symbolic. And I think it's easy for us to forget about his training and expect something different of his paintings, but we really shouldn't. He studied art as well in the States, but it was known that he was talented prior to any formal study, and only with formal study did he become better and better.
Yeah, and that sort of relates to this other question here about the grand size of his painting. And maybe you can talk a little bit to how those kind of paintings were presented too.
Yes, so they were huge, and they were meant to be. Again, it really was kind of about approximating the scale of the West. How could you depict, the amazing awesomeness of the Rockies in a field sketch? You can't, to Bierstadt's mind. So he created these monumental canvases that would have been presented almost like a theatrical experience. Sometimes they were behind a red velvet curtain that would be pulled at a fee, so you could stand in awe of these paintings. And so truly their scale was meant to approximate and also to overwhelm you in the best way, the viewer.
Great. I'm going to end on one question. Do you think he would have been a famous artist today?
It's a great question. I think he would have absolutely been appreciated for his technical prowess. I mean, this man was an amazing painter. But, in my world, I think a lot of us are interested in art that more explicitly tackles contemporary issues, and his work was quite veiled. But it is beautiful, and to our estimation, it did broach contemporary topics. So I'd have to say yes, I think he would be a successful artist today for sure.
Yes, definitely. Great. Well, a lot of artists have been inspired by him.
Absolutely. Yes, we have in our gallery several Bierstedts on view, and one of our contemporary artists represented in our collection, Don Stinson, is always really happy to be next to Albert Bierstadt in the gallery. It's quite a compliment to him. I think one that's well deserved.
Well, we all need to go to Cody and see.
Yes, come visit.
Whitney and be in Cody in a different part of Wyoming and see some of these beautiful paintings. So I guess that's all the questions, and we're right on time today.
Perfect.
Gosh, I mean, that Karen, you're inspiring. That was an inspiring talk, and you're clearly such a master on this subject. We were just in a sort of a side chat on the staff side. We were talking about how wonderful it is to just take an awe moment and have this art history lesson. And so thank you for joining our team today. And it's really been quite a nice respite for us. And I hope that the same for our members. I want to thank all of you for attending today. And again, Bill Trailer in February and Anna Hyatt Huntington in March, plus other online program that we're offering. So just keep an eye out. I'm sure you're all online, but if not, go on to wildlifeart.org and join up on our e-news. Asking our wonderful marketing director, Ali Shulin, to reveal her face. Thank you. She was our technician today and makes sure it's all happening on the backside, which is quite a lot of balls in the air. And Tammi, wonderful job stewarding this conversation. And Jane, your butterfly, I think was pretty good. So
Yes, other comments on people liking that butterfly, Jane.
we like that butterfly. So again, thank you all so much for attending and thank you for your support. And we look forward to seeing you in some fashion soon.
Thank you.
Thanks,
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 everyone.
everybody. Have a wonderful day.